Andrew Nembhard went from projected undrafted free agent to second-round pick to elite NBA role player. Can his brother Ryan do the same?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Gametime. Folks, download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Well, we did our Caliph Battle NBA Draft Preview episode on Tuesday. Now here, a couple days later, we are doing our Ryan Nembhard NBA Draft Preview, discussing his history, his draft workouts, what he's done at the G League Elite Camp and the NBA Draft Combine. We're also going to talk about his strengths and weaknesses as a prospect. We kind of know a little bit about what those are, but we're going to dig in a little deeper on that. Then we're also going to close out the show talking about his potential draft range, where he's been showing up on the mock drafts, as we're about 2 weeks away from the actual draft taking place. We'll talk about some team fits for him, some predictions where he might end up, what his next year or so might look like as a professional basketball player. Again, Caliph Battle's draft profile was on Tuesday. Nembhard is coming out today. And then we will have 2 more of these for Ben Gregg and Nolan Hickman over the next couple of weeks before that draft starts on June 25th. We'll start with Nembhard's history. Again, we won't go like piece by piece throughout his career, but he was a top 70 prospect out of high school who began his college basketball career at Creighton with the Blue Jays. He is, of course, from Canada, initially played with a tremendous amount of NBA talent while at Montverde Academy in Florida. Again, same trajectory as his brother Andrew, who, of course, went to Florida for 2 years and then transferred to Gonzaga for 2 years. Ryan just did the same thing, just starting at Creighton and then coming to Gonzaga. He was excellent at Creighton. He started 27 games as a freshman, and I mean, that was all the games that he played. He suffered an ankle injury towards the end of the year. And so even though he missed the end of the season, he was still the Big East Rookie of the Year, was still a fantastic player for them. Came back as a sophomore, started all 37 games, led them to an Elite Eight, but a heartbreaking loss to San Diego State in that Elite Eight game. All told, in 64 games and about 34 minutes per game at Creighton, Nembhard averaged about 12 points, 4.5 assists, 3.5 rebounds, shot about 34% from 3. And then very surprisingly, he hits the transfer portal, ends up at Gonzaga, despite some folks thinking he was going to go to Arizona to play for Tommy Lloyd. He ends up following in his brother's footsteps, ends up at Gonzaga with Graham Ike and Steele Venters in that transfer portal class. That was just a really excellent class, of course, for Gonzaga. We haven't seen Steele Venters yet, but certainly Nembhard and Graham have lived up to the billing. As a junior at Gonzaga, Nembhard was great, 12.5 points, 7 assists. But it really kind of took a while. The first half of the season, Nembhard still averaged 12.5 points and 6 assists per game, but he was 25% from 3. His turnover numbers were a little high. Second half of the year, his points per game stayed about the same, but he went from 6 assists to about 8 assists per game while lowering his turnovers and shooting 39% from 3. And then came last year, and we kind of wondered coming into the year of like, hey, if Nembhard can distribute the rock the way he did at the second half of last year, he could end up leading the country in assists. And he did. That's exactly what happened. And not only did he distribute the ball similarly to how he did in the second half of his junior year, he was much better. He averaged 9.8 assists per game last year, nearly the same amount of assists as points. He had 10.5 points per game, 9.8 assists. He also shot over 40% from 3. He was an outstanding three-point shooter that probably didn't get as much attention as maybe it should have. All the attention on Nembhard was about his passing, and justifiably so. But this is a guy who, again, 25.5% in his first 17 games at Gonzaga. And then in his final 18 games as a junior and his entire senior season, he was about 40%. So really a great three-point shooter that kind of, because he struggled so bad to start, he almost kind of never really got the reputation that he should have as a three-point shooter. But again, as we've talked about so many times on the show, he set the single season record for assists at Gonzaga. In fact, he set it as a junior with 243 assists. And then as a senior, he racked up 344 assists, literally beat his own single season assist record at Gonzaga by over 100 assists, broke the WCC single season record, and is fifth all time in single season assists in college basketball history. And only one of those seasons happened since 1990, and that was Kendall Marshall at North Carolina in 2011. Again, just a prolific passing season for Ryan Nembhard. After the season, he got invited to the G League Elite Camp and was one of 5 players out of 45 from that camp to then get a follow-up invitation to the actual NBA Draft Combine, where Nembhard excelled. He really boosted his draft stock with his performance at both the Elite Camp and at the Combine. We'll look at his measurements first, and this is obviously going to be a big talking point with Nembhard. We'll talk about it more in the second segment, but he measured at 5'11" without shoes. He was the second shortest player at the Combine outside of Mark Sears from Alabama. His wingspan was 6'2.25". You always like having a longer wingspan than your height, but at the end of the day, a 6'2" wingspan is still just not very big. It was also the second shortest at the Combine behind or ahead of Mark Sears. His weight, 175.8 pounds, the fourth lightest at the Combine. The 3 other players are all freshmen and all have removed themselves from the NBA draft. That was LeBaron Philon, Todd Pettiford, and Boogie Fland. So of the players at the Combine who are still in the draft process, Andrew Nembhard is in fact the lightest. He did do some really good stuff in the testing, though. His shuttle run of 2.8 seconds was the 13th fastest. His max vert of 32.5 inches was not bad for a smaller player. He was tied with Eric Dixon and Rasheer Fleming and LeBaron Philon. He was ahead of guys like Igor Demeen, Cam Jones, Alex Tui, PJ Haggerty, guys like that. And then his shooting was really shined. 24 out of 30 in the off-dribble shooting drill, which was tied for 4th in the entire Combine, tied with Liam McNeely and LeBaron Philon and Eric Dixon, ahead of guys like Cedric Howard and Ace Bailey, Trey Johnson, Kobe Brea, Tyrese Proctor, VJ Edgecombe. His spot-up shooting was 15th out of 25, 15 out of 25 is what he shot. He was tied for 16th in that event. And then his three-point shooting, which is the star drill, he shot 19 out of 25, which was literally the top shooting performance at the Combine. He was tied with Missouri's Tamar Bates. That means he was ahead of everybody else. All of the elite shooters in this draft class, Con Knippel, Liam McNeely, Kobe Brea, Walter Clayton, Chaz Lanier, Cedric Coward, Trey Johnson, Cooper Flagg, etc., Ryan Nembhard shot better than every single one of them in the star drill at the NBA Draft Combine. He also played well in the scrimmages. He had 13 points and 8 assists in his first scrimmage game. He had 6 points and 5 assists in his second scrimmage game. I think he had 3 total turnovers and 14 assists in those, 13 assists and 3 total turnovers in those 2 scrimmage games. So far, we know that that Ryan Nembhard has worked out with the Atlanta Hawks, the Golden State Warriors, and most recently his home country team, the Toronto Raptors. Very likely he's worked out with more than just those 3 teams. You don't always get reports on every team that has worked out a player, in part sometimes because teams are trying to keep it quiet and they are intentionally not reporting that, in part just because sometimes these things don't get reported. I wouldn't be surprised to find out that Nembhard ends up working out with 10 plus, maybe even as many as 15 different teams. That tends to be the case with second round picks, unless he gets a promise from somebody and decides to withdraw from working out. If a team says, hey, we'll take you at 40, but we don't want you working out with anybody else or anybody ahead of us in the draft. That's the kind of thing that could happen and could lead to Nembhard not doing many more workouts, but I'd be kind of surprised if that happened. And we'll talk a little bit about why in the second segment, because we know that Ryan Nembhard is the best passer in this draft class. There's no debate. It is unquestionable, but what else does he bring to the table? And are those skills enough to overcome his limited size? We'll talk about that in just a second. But first, folks, there is nothing like the NBA Finals. The intensity, the buzzer beaters, the fans losing all their minds is the kind of atmosphere that you have to experience live. And boy, have this year's matchups delivered in a big way. We've talked a ton about them already on the show with the Pacers Thunder series going on. And if you want in, Gametime makes it fast and easy to get seats, even for the biggest playoff games. Prices on the app, they actually go down the closer you get to tip-off. And with killer last-minute deals, panoramic seat views, and no surprise fees, Gametime is a total game changer. Plus, with the Gametime guarantee, you know you're getting the best deal. If you find a better price in the same row and section, Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. And game 4 is in Indiana on Friday. Tickets to get into the door, they're still spendy, but they're under $800 on Gametime. Hard to find them cheaper anywhere else. You also have super deals that are under $1,000, and you got a view right at center court. So folks, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms apply. Download the Gametime app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked on Zags podcast, and we are continuing our Ryan Nembhard NBA draft preview episode, talking strengths, talking weaknesses, team fits, draft range, measurements, history, all sorts of stuff, as we use this as a perfect way to kind of get a full scope picture of Ryan Nembhard ahead of the 2025 NBA draft. Again, we did one of these for Caliph Battle on Tuesday's episode. We'll do 2 more of these for Nolan Hickman and Ben Gregg later this month. Now we move on to the strengths for Ryan Nembhard, and it's pretty obvious where we're going to start this conversation. He's an elite passer. He is one of the best passers in college basketball history, and the ability to see the floor, to make plays for players, and get his teammates the ball in positions to score is uncanny. I mean, it's truly one of the best. I know that people will push back on him being the best passer in the draft class, in the sense that people will like to mention Igor Demin from BYU and his creativity as a passer. And look, Demin's passing may translate better to the NBA because he's 6'9" and has, a physical advantage over Nembhard. But I maintain firmly that nobody was a better passer than Ryan Nembhard. When you look at the tape and you just look at the stats, I mean, obviously led the country in assists and total assists. He led the country in assists per game at 9.8. But beyond that, his assist to turnover ratio was nearly 4-1. Like, he had the ball in his hands constantly. He played 35 minutes a game in a high octane, up and down the floor offense that gets more possessions than most teams in college basketball. Ryan Nembhard, who had the ball in his hands nearly every possession while playing 35 minutes a game. Typically, that confluence of factors would lead to a player having a high turnover rate, and Nembhard did not, because he is so good at taking care of the basketball, making the correct reads. I mean, there's not really any passing skills that he doesn't have. Transition passing, check. He is so great at locating his bigs when they get a rebound, finding them for an outlet pass, and flying up and down the floor. He will push the tempo at any opportunity that it is there, and he will make the right read, find somebody in transition, pull back if he needs to. And if you're in the half court, his ability to utilize ball screens, impeccable. Impeccable feel for the game. That's a quote from Sam Vecini's phenomenal draft write-up preview about Ryan Nembhard, about all the players in the draft process. And it's incredibly true. There is nothing that Ryan Nembhard cannot do from a passing perspective with the basketball. He uses ball screens exceptionally well. He's smart on his reads, when to go to the rim, when to look for a passer, when to kick it out to a shooter, when to throw a lob over the top to a big down low. Any kind of pass, bounce pass, using his eyes to deflect the defender to get somebody open. Anything you want a guard to do with the basketball in terms of passing, Ryan Nembhard not only can do it, he can do it at a super high level. And again, the ability to not only do that, but take care of the basketball. There are some riskier passers. Again, I'll pick on Demin a little bit, of he can make some jaw-dropping highlight reel passes, but he's also more prone to turn the ball over. Nembhard is a bit steadier, a bit more secure. He does do flashy passes. He had plenty of them last year, but he's also just really good at his basketball IQ is through the roof, and he makes the smart read, the right read 95+% of the time, it seems. We also saw a Ryan Nembhard that became a more willing shooter and just a better shooter. I mean, I think that's the easiest way to describe it. Last year, again, his ability to read screens was great. And when teams started going under him on screens, which happened 2 years ago when he struggled to shoot out of the gate, and then Gonzaga kind of corrected it a little bit, he got better. This past year, when teams went under on screens on him, he would read that and recognize that he needed to pull up and shoot. And he did really well on that. According to Sam Vecini, who used Synergy Sports for this, Nembhard shot about 37% on 1.5 pull-up three-point attempts per game. So he didn't take a ton of them, but when the situation called for it and he read the screen and he saw the defenders going under, I'm going to pull up and shoot a three here, he knocked them down 37% of the time. That's pretty darn good. Pull-up threes are not easy. He also gets to his mid-range extremely well. He can do it off either foot. He can do it going left or right. He recognizes the opportunities when, hey, I'm not going to get all the way to the cup, or I'm going to get stuck down there. So I'm going to stop, jump off both feet, and shoot a mid-range jumper, which he made about 45% of the time, which is very, especially for a player his size, that's great. He was also 44% on catch and shoot threes last year. Excellent three-point shooter. Yes, it was one attempt per game, and we'll get to that in the weaknesses, but when Nembhard was shooting threes, when he had catch and shoot opportunities, or even when he recognized ball screen actions and took threes, he knocked him down at a very high clip. Nembhard also finished really well at the rim, 57.5% at the rim. For a player his size, that is exceptional. Part of the reason that Nembhard had such a high rate of finishing at the rim is because he was smart about picking his moments. This is a good and a bad thing. His intelligence, knowing when to attack the rim, when to go all the way to the basket. I mean, how many times last year did he come off a screen and kind of pump fake or hesitate, recognize the defense, and then quickly take two more dribbles and get a wide open lay-in? Graham Ike would seal his guy. Nembhard would recognize it. Boom, wide open shot at the rim, and he'd score. It was phenomenal and it was beautiful basketball. But those were the kind of attempts that Nembhard was taking at the rim. So that's why that 57% is very high. And when he didn't have opportunities to score at the rim, he just wouldn't. And there's not necessarily anything bad about that for Gonzaga. Like, Gonzaga would have preferred that he didn't do that. But from an NBA perspective, the hesitation around getting to the rim might be viewed as a negative. We'll get into more of the negatives in a second, but another strength for him, he's just a hardworking defender. He works hard. He's got active hands. He plays with tenacity. He's good at poking the basketball away. He's always in the right spot. He's again, the high basketball IQ translates to the defensive end of the floor as well. Weaknesses, pretty much all of his weaknesses boil down to size. It's unfortunate, but it is the reality. Nembhard is 5'11". He has a 6'2.2" wingspan. He has a 7'10" standing reach, and he's 175 pounds. By every one of these measurements, Ryan Nembhard would be one of, if not the smallest player in the NBA next year. I mean, we're not just talking about, oh, he's undersized for his position. He's one of the smallest players. One of the smallest players at the combine would be one of the smallest players in the NBA. A 7'10" standing reach. I mean, there's guys who have a standing reach over 9 feet. Like, and again, you're not expecting him to play like a big, but he's not big. He's, the comparison to Andrew, and like, oh, Andrew got better as a defender. He got more willing as a shooter, like things that absolutely could happen for Ryan. Ryan could improve defensively. He could become a more willing shooter or scorer than he was in college. Again, both those things happened to Andrew, but Andrew is 5 inches taller. He has 5 more inches on his wingspan. Like, he's got a significant amount more weight. He's just a bigger person. And there's not a lot Ryan can do about that. He can get a little stronger. He can put on a little bit of weight, but he's not going to grow. Like, he is limited because of his size. And it is unfortunate because it limits him on both ends of the floor. It's also worth pointing out that while Nembhard is not a bad athlete, he's not an incredible athlete. He is a perfectly fine athlete. His jumping is okay. He doesn't have a lot of burst. Most of his athleticism is rooted in his balance and hand-eye coordination, which are both capital E exceptional, and they allow him to be so great as a point guard, and they allow him to finish through contact at a higher clip than a player his size typically would. But at the end of the day, he doesn't have a huge first step. He doesn't have a lot of burst. He is not a big vertical leaper, and he would have to be an otherworldly athlete to be able to kind of fully mitigate the size concerns, and frankly, he's just not. And as we've already kind of touched on a little bit, he's a bit of a tentative scorer. Teams last year were able to stop Gonzaga when they forced Ryan to become a scorer. Not every team. You may recall the San Francisco game where the Dons worked really hard to basically say, we want Nembhard to beat us with his scoring, not his passing. And he did. And Coach Gerlofson after the game basically said, yeah, that was our strategy, and it didn't work because he's really good. But like, there was a reason that was an attempted strategy. UCLA did it, and it worked. In the NCAA tournament, Ryan Nembhard had 11 assists and 10 turnovers and only 8 field goal attempts. That's not in the Houston game. That's in both games combined, by the way. Against bigger, more physical, tougher, frankly, NBA caliber guards, Ryan Nembhard was a tentative offensive player as a scorer. He was still a great facilitator, but he didn't look to score as much against bigger, more physical teams, and that is a concern for him when he gets into the NBA, and all of the players he goes up against are going to be bigger and more physical. Does that mean he becomes completely tentative offensively and only looks to facilitate? Because if so, that's not going to work. You cannot break down a defense if they are not at all concerned about your ability to score. It doesn't work. So that's a big issue for Nembhard. And again, it relates back to his size. And then defensively, he's just, he can work as hard as he wants, as hard as he can. It's going to be limited because of his size. when he gets switched onto wings, they're either going to shoot right over the top of him, which there's just not a lot he can do about, or they're going to put the ball on the deck and just drive through his chest. He's 175 pounds. Most NBA wings are probably 220, 215 at least. Like they're just going to move past him or through him if they need to. He's always in the right spot. He's not going to hurt you with bad decision-making defensively, but he is very limited in how impactful he can be on that end of the floor simply because of his size. Again, it sucks. In some ways, it's not fair, but it is the reality of the situation for Ryan Nembhard. Well, despite the size limitations, the performances that we've seen from Nembhard throughout the elite camp and the combine and the workouts have put him in a position where he's starting to show up more often than not on these actual mock drafts. We're going to talk about that. Where might he get drafted? What might that look like? What are some team fits for him? We'll make some projections, all of that coming up here in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, still doing our Ryan Nembhard 2025 NBA draft profile here. Talked about Nembhard's history, his performance last year at Gonzaga. We also talked about his strengths and weaknesses as a draft prospect, his performance at the G League Elite Camp, NBA Draft Combine, his measurements. Now, we're going to take a look at what the mock drafts are saying, his actual range for this upcoming draft, some team fits for him, and then make our projections for his likely outcome. Right now, it feels like, having scoped out mock drafts from reputable sources, which for me are the big websites, CBS, Yahoo, ESPN, sites like that, as well as some smaller sites like No Ceilings does a phenomenal job with their draft content. I mentioned Sam Vecini at The Athletic. His was a big board recently, not a mock draft, but when they come out with mock drafts, we'll check those out. The Ringer has a mock draft out as well, et cetera, et cetera. Bleacher Report, tons of great mocks out there, tons of great content. Ryan Nembhard is about 50-50 at this point, meaning about half the time he is in the mock draft, somewhere in the first 59 players selected, since one of the teams, I think the Knicks, have a second-round pick forfeited, and about half the time he's not showing up in the mock draft at all. So realistically, and again, mock drafts are not always super accurate, but right now it's kind of a toss-up on whether he is going to get selected on June 26th, because the first round is June 25th, the second round is June 26th. I don't want to say never, but it doesn't look super likely that Ryan Nembhard will go in the first round, but the odds of him going in the second round, about 50-50 at this point. I've seen him as high as the early 40s. I'm not sure I've seen a mock draft that had him in the 30s. I think there was one that had him like 39th maybe. But so he's kind of showing up somewhere in the late 30s, early 40s. That's kind of the top end. Again, obviously the bottom end is not showing up in the draft, but you frequently see him in the early 50s, mid 50s, kind of throughout the middle to the end of the second round is a pretty common place for him to land. And as we've talked about a few times on the show, the odds of Ryan Nembhard getting drafted significantly improved after the NBA withdrawal deadline, where many players, a lot of them being pure point guards, decided to return to college basketball instead of staying in the draft process. Teams that maybe would have drafted LeBaron Philon from Alabama, or Boogie Fland, who was at Arkansas, transferred to Florida, or Tahad Pettiford at Auburn, or Milos Uzan from Houston, or Otega Owe, or many of the other players who opted to return to school. They don't have the option to draft those players anymore. And so Ryan Nembhard becomes a more appealing point guard target for teams that need a point guard that can't draft Todd Pettiford or Fland or Philon or any of those guys. So I think that'll help him. I think it'll help Caleb Battle. I think it'll help Ben Gregg and Nolan Hickman, not necessarily in terms of their odds of getting drafted. I think those are quite slim, but the less players that are competing for spots in summer leagues, the better. And that's a good sign for those guys as well. In terms of team fit, we kind of talked about this with Battle being like a guy who's not really impervious to where he ends up, because he's just like a microwave scorer off the bench, and every team kind of could use a guy like that. Nembhard's a little bit more specific, I think, in terms of what kind of team would truly use him. Like, he could end up in various spots, but some spots just I don't think would be a good fit for him. I think the ideal spot for Ryan Nembhard is a team that is in need of a third point guard that is contending right away, a winning team, or a team that is attempting to contend right away. Because if the team's in rebuild mode, they're less likely to go after Nembhard. In some ways, I think that could work. He could be like a good tank commander, or like an older prospect who can contribute right away and maybe help some of the younger guys, because he'll be older than some of the players on some of those young teams. But I think the most likely outcome is he goes to a good team that views him as like a two-way contract, third point guard. And I think one of the things that really could help him is Ryan Nembhard would be an exceptional player to have on your G League roster. And I think that this needs more this is not something that gets talked about very often, but I think it adds a ton of value for a Ryan Nembhard specifically. Because your G League team, you typically will have 1 to 2 players on your G League roster that you're really evaluating. Whether it was a guy you drafted late in the second round who's, a 19-year-old freshman that you think has a lot of upside, whether it's an international guy that you signed that you're like, we just kind of want to see what this kid can do, or whether it's a guy who's kind of floats in and out of your roster and you just want to see, hey, what does he look like if he's in a more featured role in the G League? Well, you need a dude to set the table. You need a dude who's actually everybody in the G League is trying to make the NBA. And if everybody on your G League roster, if their sole goal is to put up as many points as possible, your team is going to suck. They're going to be bad. Ask the G League Ignite. Doesn't exist anymore because it was unwatchable basketball because everybody on that roster wanted to score because they wanted to get drafted in the lottery. And they tried to mitigate that. They actually brought in David Stockton, who I think fits the bill here of like, we want a pass first point guard to kind of help share the love. Again, it didn't work for the Ignite, but a smart, shrewd NBA team would bring in Ryan Nembhard, stash him in the G League if they don't have room on the active roster, and let him make their other players better. That is a smart move. That is what good NBA general managers do. Teams that make sense for that, he's already worked out with Golden State, Atlanta, and Toronto, so I think you have to put them at the top of the list. Again, Toronto's not really a contending team right now. They're kind of in the middle, but the Canadian connection makes a ton of sense there. Atlanta sort of depends what they do this offseason, but as like a backup, I mean, Atlanta knows what to do with small guards in Trae Young, so maybe it could work there. Golden State would be a really fun fit for him, kind of behind Steph and Pajemski. They got some other guards on that roster too, Moses Moody, whomever else, but having him be kind of an option there would be a lot of fun as well. And I'll toss out Orlando. Orlando's got a lot of really good defensive guards. Jalen Suggs, of course, among them. Anthony Black among them. A few others as well. They need some more offensive firepower. Nembhard's not a great, I don't think his three-point shooting translates at an elite level, and that's what they really need. But as a pass-first point guard, third-string guard for this team, I think he could really fit. And then, of course, the Pacers. You got to throw the Pacers in there. Playing with his brother, playing behind his brother could be a lot of fun. I don't know if Indiana will pull the trigger necessarily, but certainly if he's undrafted, they'll be one of the teams to give him a call. I can guarantee you that. And in terms of the likely outcome, I don't think he'll be undrafted. I feel pretty confident, maybe a bit biased, but I feel pretty confident that Ryan Nembhard will get drafted on June 26th. I think if he doesn't, it's because he's still available in the 50s and his agent's telling teams, hey, we would rather go undrafted, which that happens, by the way. Reportedly, that happened with Drew Timme, where he said, I would rather sign somewhere than get drafted and be kind of locked into a certain team. So that could be the case with Nembhard, but I think ultimately he will get drafted. And I think he will compete and ultimately sign a two-way contract. I think he's a good enough player that with the number of two-way contracts that exists in the basketball space, the professional ranks, he will get one of them. And he will spend a lot of time in the G League, and he will make that G League team better. And at the end of the regular season in the NBA, when teams are either tanking or have injuries or arresting players or some combination of all of those things, Ryan Nembhard will get an opportunity to make his NBA debut. This is my prediction, is that Ryan Nembhard does play in the NBA this season. I don't know that it'll happen super early in the season, but I think it'll happen by the end of the year. He will join his brother in the NBA. Hopefully in Indiana, that'd be cool. It's probably unlikely, but you never know. Maybe it'll happen. If it's not Indiana, I have a strong push for Orlando or Golden State. Those would be my top choices. And I'm a Blazers fan, so I would love him there too. Would love him there to help Scoot Henderson become a bit more of a passer, as he's more of a score-first guy. He's a good passer, but you could use it. Anybody could use a Ryan Nembhard. And it'd be fun to get to see him play again at the Child Center if he was on that G League team, the Rip City Remix, because that is where they play their home games. That's going to wrap it up for me today here. And we'll have more about Ryan Nembhard as we get more updates on his workouts. And so, we'll continue to check the mock drafts. And if he's rising up, if there's new updates there, we'll definitely have more on that. The NBA draft, one of the biggest topics over the next couple of weeks here on Locked On Zags, although it is not the biggest topic, as we will continue to keep you up to date on the Pac-12. After Gonzaga signed their grant of rights, we are expecting a media rights deal to be announced within the week, potentially. We'll also hopefully hear more about what teams are going to join the Pac-12 starting in 26-27. So look for updates on that, updates on Ryan Nembhard and the NBA draft process, more recruiting and transfer portal updates coming as they are announced as well. Thanks again, folks, for listening. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. And of course, as always, go Zags.